Yes, it's okay.
Fantastic.
So,
And I hope you can all see my screen.
yeah,
Um,
just maybe a few words to present you
oh,
because I explained the
mhm,
things about the webinar, but I didn't explain who you are. So
sure.
if you Talia will present today her work, her PhD work, your doctorate work on LGBTQ plus people emigrated from Russia to Tbilisi following the full-scale invasion, Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And Talia Kollek is currently completing her doctorate at the University of Oxford. Her research on Russian LGBTQ plus civil society and activism is based on her time spent living and working in St. Petersburg, where she completed her master's degree at High School of Economics in 2000. Um, in 2000, I don't remember the year because I didn't.
Gosh, I also forget. It was
By the
2017,
end of the
2018.
year,
2018. That's
I
about it.
think, yeah.
2018. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So Talia specializes in ethnographic research in high-risk environments, and she was the co-organizer of the LGBTQ plus studies at risk conference last year in 2023. So Talia, the floor is yours, if you want.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Olga. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for inviting me to come speak. So yes, as Olga mentioned, my name's Talia. I study LGBT activism, Russian LGBT activism. And my research is, as Olga mentioned, based on my time living in St. Petersburg. But not only that, I actually came out as a lesbian when I was living in St. Petersburg myself. My plan, and I have really deep ties to the community there. And so until the full scale invasion, the plan for my research had been to return to these communities and follow the ways that they were adapting to increasingly repressive homophobic legislation. And as you might be able to understand, that has all changed. So, following Russia's full scale invasion of Ukraine, a number of my participants fled the country. And so this was for a variety of reasons. Some of them feared political repression. So, for example, if you have a group of people who are activists, a circle of activists, and they're all being arrested one by one, it's quite reasonable to assume you might be next and it's time to go. Some people were labeled as foreign agents, or the organizations that they worked for were labeled as foreign agents. And some correctly guessed that conditions for LGBT people in Russia were going to get worse after the full scale invasion. Many of my friends ended up in Georgia. And so that's where I also ended up for my fieldwork. I was there for about 8 months in total. So there was a period after the full scale invasion and before I arrived for fieldwork where I would speak to my friends on the phone, the ones who had left. And so I was getting a sort of partial picture of what this emigration process looked like. And so on the phone, my friends would describe this huge sense of relief at having sort of escaped, at having left Russia. And in my mind, I pictured the process of emigration to look something like this. Oh, if I can get my slide to go. To look something like this, right? People were unsafe in Russia, and now they have left and gone to Georgia, and now they're safe. This is how I pictured it in my mind. Uh, and so, I knew that sure, moving to a new country is a stressful experience. And for many people, it was also a really financially precarious decision. But before I arrived for fieldwork, I still had assumed that it was this sort of general upwards trajectory. People were going from an unsafe place to a safe place. Sort of, it was simple in my mind. And of course, when I arrived for my fieldwork, I found out that this wasn't the case. So one example, uh, early on in my fieldwork, about a month in, I was in Georgia when partial mobilization was announced. And this set off a new wave of panic. People were worried that the borders would close and they wouldn't be able to escape conscription. Airline ticket prices soared again. Lines at the border stretched for days. It was pandemonium. And there were protests in Georgia, Russians protesting partial mobilization. And I took part in one of those protests. And so here's a photo from that. And I'm on the far left there. And so what surprised me about this protest? I was surprised that it was a small group, right? There were about 10 of us. We were gathered there in the pouring rain. And for those who have been to Georgia and experienced the rain, when it rains, it really rains. So we're gathered in the rain. We're sort of huddled under a bit of a shelter. We all have a sort of hastily made, signs that have been put together. And everyone kind of knew each other, right? So it was a small group. There wasn't really anyone to see us. Again, because of the rain. So we were all standing there. Again, people were talking with each other. And yet, the person on the far right in this photograph, the one who's got their back to the camera, arrived at the protest in this full face mask. Completely wanted, and not for COVID reasons, they wanted to disguise their identity. And again, this seemed a little bit strange to me because the only people who even approached our protest were that we didn't know, or that the group didn't know, were some tourists who had gotten lost. Right? So we weren't doing anything illegal. We were outside of Russia. So, there wasn't necessarily, you would think that there would not be a threat of Russian state interference or anything in our small protest in Georgia. There was a small group of us. There was no police presence or interest, and there was no public interest in our activity. And so I was a little bit surprised that this person had been this cautious, right? Again, if we consider this unsafe to safe trajectory, I would have assumed that these type of measures weren't necessary anymore. And so yeah, here in the photo, you can see the one person's got their back to the camera and somebody else has actually covered their face with their sign. I also recognize the irony of the fact that I have also blurred the faces of people here. The photo was posted to social media, but I take an abundance of caution. But yeah, as you can see, and so I haven't blurred my face here, and what you can actually see in this photograph, I can tell you exactly what I was thinking at this precise moment. And what I was thinking was, oh God, should I be covering my face too? You can see my sign is like inching up here. And so my question coming out of this was, okay, so what is the situation? What preconceptions have I brought to this about people's feelings of safety that are maybe incorrect? So the question that I'm gonna talk about in this presentation today was, when and how do Russian LGBTQ people feel safe when they emigrate? So I'll start with a little bit of context. I'll talk about those preconceptions that I mentioned and what sort of challenged them. And then I'm going to talk about when and how my participants felt safer living in Georgia. So firstly, though, I want to take a moment to talk about my choice of subject material. So my research deals with both the safety and well-being of Russian LGBTQ people, and also how they imagine their futures. And quite rightly, I've had Ukrainians tell me that they are really sick of conversations about Russian futures when Ukraine is facing an existential crisis as we speak. So that's in terms of Ukraine. In terms of Georgia, I also recognize that by focusing on the experiences of Russians, I really do not want to understate the impact that this influx of Russian migration in Georgia has had on Georgians, ordinary Georgians. So thousands of Russians migrating to Georgia has caused a massive spike in the cost of living. And this often displaced Georgians from their homes, their businesses, and their community spaces. And that's all of that as well, but not even to say that Russia currently occupies 20% of Georgia's internationally recognized territory. And so as a result, Georgians are understandably quite wary to be hosting so many Russians in their country. And Georgian LGBTQ community in particular is criminally understudied academically. So I think that researchers like myself who are obligated to critically assess our choice of focus on Russia. And I don't think that I have a particularly satisfactory justification about my research focus, other than to say that my work came because of my very deep personal ties with the Russian LGBTQ community, which I mentioned before, and that I've been intertwined with now for about 8 years. So in addition, I think it's important to note that many of my participants did their best to fight the Putin regime. And ultimately, their stories are a piece of the puzzle in understanding how we have reached the point at which we now find ourselves. And their stories are hopefully the ones that I'm capable of telling. So let's talk a little bit about conditions for LGBTQ people in Russia now. I'm going to give a very brief overview of conditions over the past decade or so. So the emergence of the Russian LGBTQ scene into the public eye in Russia intersected with the sort of 1990s and 2000s And this was alongside the import of lots of Western media, consumer goods, and culture. And so as a result, while queer people have obviously existed in Russia since time immemorial, LGBTQ can be seen as another sort of Western import. And so this has paved the way for narratives that we see in Russia today of LGBTQ as some sort of international movement, as an imposition on Russian culture and a threat to Russian sovereignty, this sort of thing. But today's rhetoric amped up slowly. So it beginning sort of with the 2013 gay propaganda law in Russia, which outlawed the promotion of non-traditional relations to minors. And over the last 10 years, I argued that LGBTQ issues in Russia have been a sort of canary in the coal mine, a warning with homophobic legislation targeted at LGBTQ people. These same tactics then used more broadly afterwards to suppress civil society and political dissent in Russia in general. Following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this process has accelerated at a breakneck speed. And this includes crackdowns on any form of activism and dissent or speech that challenges the Kremlin's narratives, but in particular, framing LGBTQ people as foreign, as enemies, and as a threat to Russia's well-being and Russian children. So as a result, I mentioned that many of my friends who had the ability to leave Russia have left. A few people have stayed on principle, but that number has dwindled as well. So, who has ended up, of all of the people who have left Russia, who's ended up in Georgia? So my fieldwork in Georgia does mean that I'm looking at a certain facet, a certain part of the Russian LGBTQ community. So these were people who, first of all, were free to leave, right? People who were not imprisoned for something. It was mostly those with the financial means to leave. So for example, if they had remote employment. But this was absolutely not the case for everyone. So I had some participants who it was the choice between leaving or arrest. And that's not really much of a choice. Most often, the people who I encountered in Georgia didn't have children. And I think that's just a fact that it's a lot easier to pick up your life and go when you don't also have to worry about the welfare of your child. The majority of my participants that I spoke to were ethnic Russians, but not all of them. And my sample tended to skew younger. So I think I didn't have any participants over the age of 40, for example. Everyone who I spoke to had an international passport. And that may seem obvious as sort of, yeah, they're outside of Russia. Of course, they have an international passport. But there are certain countries such as Kazakhstan where Russians can go with their domestic passports or domestic ID. And so what that meant is that my participants in Georgia were people who were fortunate enough to either have traveled internationally before or had the resources to be able to get a passport, an international passport, when they needed one. And in terms of my sort of inclusion criteria for who I spoke to about and who I count as my participants, all of my participants were people who participated in some form of LGBTQ civil society in Russia. So some of that was stuff that we might obviously consider to be activism, like organizing protests or challenging legislation or educating on queer issues. And some of that would be what we might not necessarily traditionally think of as activism. So something like building an informal community center, mutual aid, or even online blogging, sort of quiet forms of what I would deem to be quiet forms of activism. So as I mentioned previously, I came to fieldwork with a handful of assumptions. So what were some of those assumptions? The first was emigration was a one-way street. Once somebody left Russia, that was it. They weren't going back. The second assumption was that the only way for somebody to become safe was to leave Russia and move to Georgia. And the third assumption was that as long as you stayed in Georgia, there was no reason to be worried about retaliation from the Russian state. And surprise, all of these assumptions proved to be incorrect. So first of all, starting with emigration as a one-way street. So we have, as I had before, this graphic of sort of unsafe in Russia, safe in Georgia. And based on the fact that my participants, many of them went to huge lengths to leave Russia, huge amounts of effort, incredibly expensive, I would have never thought that anyone would go back. And yet, that's what I had assumed to be a one-way street was people would go back on trips. First of all, to say trips back to Russia were not an option for everyone. So for the people who made those trips, it tended to be people for whom the risk of arrest was sort of a gray zone. So in the months that followed the full-scale invasion, it became a lot clearer who was and who wasn't at risk of being arrested. And so this allowed my participants to better understand their own risk profile when they returned. For some people, this was completely unambiguous. If they returned, they would be arrested, for example, if they had outstanding charges against them. But for the majority of people, it was a lot murkier than that. The other demographic that could not go back on trips were the people who were at risk of conscription. So what I found was that after the announcement of partial mobilization, it was almost exclusively women who would do these return trips to Russia. So why, again, after putting so much effort into leaving, why would anyone go back? And it was for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it was sick parents. Sometimes it was for funerals, university examinations, for example, if it was something that couldn't be done online, renewing documents, or even to fetch pets. So some people left so quickly that they left, for example, their cat with their sister or something. And so they would make a trip back to Russia to go fetch the cat. I also want to say that just because people were going back doesn't mean that these trips were not without risk. So for example, there was a high profile case of this trip that went wrong. And that was the case of Idris Arasmikov, who was a gay man from Chechnya who was arrested upon his return from the Netherlands. So it wasn't Georgia, but he returned from the Netherlands to go to the funeral of his father, and he was arrested. And this arrest sent shockwaves through my group of friends. And so while I found that people would talk maybe casually about taking a trip back, that these trips weren't necessarily worry-free. And nonetheless, as I mentioned, these trips back and forth really challenged this idea of emigration as a process that once started was strictly in one direction. So secondly, I assumed that the only way to become safe was by leaving Russia and moving to Georgia. And I have two case studies that challenge that, the first being of Misha and the second being of Margarita. And by the way, I've changed all the names of everyone in this as a security measure, just to be fully transparent there. So Misha was one of the Septemberists who fled conscription after partial mobilization was announced. And so he moved from a large metropolitan city in Russia to a small Georgian town. And he chose Georgia because he had family there who would house and support him. And so I asked him, what would you have done if you hadn't had this family in Georgia? And I assumed the answer was going to be that he would have chosen another country, or maybe he would have chosen Georgia anyway. But the answer was, he said, I maybe would have hidden myself somewhere in Russia. And so for Misha, safety didn't necessarily mean leaving Russia, but instead a transition from a large city where one might be surveyed or targeted to an inconspicuous rural environment where he felt he could hide himself. So when he described the challenges he faced as being a Russian immigrant to Georgia, they weren't challenges of the fact that he was a Russian in Georgia. The challenge was instead that he was a big city kid who had gone from a large city with a large LGBT population to now living at a small town where he didn't have that. And so the fact that Misha's journey centered from the move of urban to rural, as opposed to from Russia to Georgia, was a surprise to me and challenged this idea that crossing a border is what made someone safe. Similarly, my conversation with Margarita challenged my idea that leaving Russia was the only way to be safe. So I met Margarita. Margarita was a bit of an exception. I met her during her short trip to Tbilisi. But she does still live in Russia, so she'd come for a short trip. And so for her, the compartmentalization of her life allowed her to establish a safe enough space for her to live in Russia. So she said, quote, I'm not sure if it's healthy. There are two worlds in Russia in regards to queerness. The world no one speaks about and the world that exists. So Margarita had segregated her life into two distinct categories. In her day-to-day life, she described living in the existing world. So she would go to work, have conversations with her colleague, spend time with her family. At times, however, she slipped into, quote, the world that no one speaks about. And she would join her LGBTQ community for organized events under the radar and go on retreats to the woods. So therefore, for Margarita, while it wasn't possible for her to leave Russia, she couldn't leave Russia because of her job, she was able to maintain this complete separation of her worlds, which she could carefully cross back and forth between during designated periods. So this allowed Margarita to feel safe enough to continue living in Russia, although this wasn't without its limits. So in our conversation, I mentioned something to her about, quote, LGBTQ community support, and she stopped me and she interrupted me. And she said, "We don't have support, we have corners." And so Margarita had managed to, again, sort of segregate these parts of her lives, but this was not an ideal solution. So these two case studies nonetheless complicate this narrative that I'd arrived with of existing in Russia as inescapably dangerous and moving to Georgia as representing safety. And so on that third point, the moving to Georgia as representing safety, I had assumed that if you moved to Georgia, you would have no reason to fear the Russian state. Well, with some, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but roughly. And to be clear, I would say that everyone I spoke to felt safer for having moved. I want to be very clear about that. People moved abroad because they felt Georgia was a safer place to live, and they did in fact feel safer in terms of Russian state repression, but they didn't feel entirely safe. And that is, again, exemplified by this protest that I went to with the person who had covered their face. So I didn't speak to this protester myself because I figured that somebody who's that cautious about safety and privacy probably doesn't want a researcher coming up to them and asking them a bunch of personal questions. So I didn't ask them about their motivations. But as this wasn't an illegal protest, I really doubt that this person hid their identity out of fear of the Georgian authorities. So they may have chosen to hide their face because they needed to return to Russia at some point. They may be concerned about loved ones who remain in Russia being associated with them, for example, or because they feared some sort of retaliation or surveillance abroad. And so I should note as well that this fear of retaliation is not entirely baseless. There have been a handful of cases of Russian journalists and activists abroad who have alleged that they have been poisoned. So there is some sort of perhaps reason that that fear might exist for people. Another example of the sort of anxieties that people had about the role of the Russian state for them in Georgia was that multiple participants expressed to me that they were concerned that now that there were so many Russians that had moved to Georgia, that Putin was going to use this as a pretense for a full-scale invasion of Georgia as well. And so while I think that scenario, personally think that scenario is implausible, it speaks to the anxiety that participants were experiencing, that even after they had left Russia, that somehow Russia would expand its borders and claw them back. Again, I want to stress this fear was far from universal. So many of those I spoke to felt safer for having moved abroad. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that safety looks like now. So I'm going to talk about safety in 3 different locations. I'm going to talk about feeling safe at home, on the street, and at queer events. So we'll start with at home. So home in Georgia offered some of my participants a type of safety that was unavailable to them in Russia. So my participants had left Russia because they felt unsafe, even at home. And for those who were visibly queer, they weren't necessarily safe in public in Georgia either. So one participant, AJ, had a gender-affirming medical treatment in Georgia and is visibly gender nonconforming. They're visibly trans. And AJ told me about being chased down in the street by a group of Georgian men who mistook them for a gay man and were threatening to beat them up. So for AJ, Georgia was still a place of refuge. So AJ's situation, if they were one of the people who, if they went back, arrest was certain, right? So Georgia did still provide them with refuge, but they were they felt that the only way that they could maintain their safety was to retreat to their home. So for example, this quote here, "If I stay in the apartment in Tbilisi and I don't go outside, I think I'll be fine. It is better than a Russian prison." So AJ's case highlights how some Russian LGBTQ people needed to retreat twice. They firstly needed to retreat by fleeing Russia and moving to Georgia. And secondly, they had to retreat from the public eye in Georgia to the safety of their own homes. So home thus functioned as a retreat for a few of my participants to be able to express their queerness. However, just because home was a place to express queerness didn't necessarily mean that home was safe. Home might feel unsafe for other reasons. So for example, one participant, Daria, was really struggling with her absentee landlord. And she showed me pictures of a blackened fuse box. So there'd been an electrical short and a sort of small explosion. And she told me, quote, "I heard a pop. There could have been a fire. At least I was home." And what surprised me when she was telling me the story is, as she was telling me the story, seemingly out of nowhere, she started to cry. And so clearly this was something that was really weighing on her, this feeling of being unsafe in her own home. So she told me about this story of a building in Batumi, which is Georgia's second largest city. And that building had collapsed the year before. So what had happened was construction workers had been doing renovations on the ground floor, and they had simply removed all of the supporting walls of the ground floor, some of which were structural. And the building was supposed to be a 5-story building, but there were 2 additional illegal stories that were built on top of it. And so the 7 stories had sagged, and nothing had been done to address the issue. And so Daria told me, quote, "The building collapsed. Of course it collapsed and people died." So Daria felt safe and unsafe at home for different reasons. When she was living in Russia, she'd been really worried that somebody was going to somehow spy on her and report her to the police. So she told me about a gay couple whose neighbor had accused them of gay propaganda because the neighbor's child had seen this gay couple through the window into their own apartment, and that this classified it and had reported them to the police. And so Daria had been really worried because she had a pride flag that she hung in her apartment, and she was worried that the same might happen to her. And so in Georgia, Daria was able to display this flag without concern. So she was worried about the structural integrity of her apartment, about her landlord not fixing electrical issues. She was worried because her building also had illegal additions on top, right? And so she was worried about, again, the structural integrity of her building, but she was able to express her sexuality at home in a way that she hadn't been able to in Russia. So home in Georgia thus offered a form of safety that participants such as AJ and Daria were not able to achieve in Russia, and that was this space to express their queerness without fear of arrest or fear of prying eyes. What happened when people left home? So, for example, on the street. So when it came to participants' sense of safety and security outside of the home, what I found was that there was no uniform consensus among participants about what safety looked like. So what I found was in all cases, or the vast majority of cases, for Russian LGBTQ people in Georgia, public spaces made them very conscious of their Russianness in a way that they hadn't had to navigate when they lived in Russia. Despite this, some expressed only positive experiences and told me that they felt perfectly safe as a Russian person in Georgia. So one example is from Kira, a lesbian from St. Petersburg. And so when I asked her, does she feel safe? She told me, quote, "I walked home at night once across Tbilisi, didn't see another soul. Yes, I feel safer here. I don't need to count every tochka, every period in a text before I post it. I feel safer." Kira's description of what she considers safety, so the ability to walk home at night and freedom from online censorship, collapses the spheres of the digital and the real world, which challenges the literature on Russian queer digital media, which posits that the internet is this sort of separate space where Russian LGBTQ people can find belonging. So in Kira's case, by moving to a space where she deemed herself to be safe offline, the online world became less threatening to navigate as well. The second thing I found in discussions about participants about how safe they felt on the street was that these feelings were really subjective. And by that, I mean that participants could be confronted with the exact same environment or scenario and interpret it as safe or unsafe based on different factors. A prime example of this was how anti-Russian graffiti was interpreted by participants. So for those who don't know, anti-Russian graffiti is ubiquitous in Tbilisi, and I got into the habit of collecting photographs of it during my fieldwork. So I'll show a few now. So the first one, for example, is the sign that was hanging off a balcony. So Putin is killing people in Ukraine while Russians eat khachapuri, which is a Georgian dish in Georgia. No Russian is welcome, good or bad. And some of them were a bit, a bit shocking. So this one says rape Russian kids. So this graffiti elicited a variety of responses from my participant. One was completely unbothered, and he even found it to be kind of funny. So he said, quote, "When I see fuck Russians, I think, yeah, fuck me. I understand why they write it. It doesn't bother me." Some didn't take the graffiti personally. and understood why somebody might write these things and understood the sentiment because of Russia's Russian and Georgian history, and also because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But others took the graffiti very seriously, such as one participant, Alyona, who described being alone at a car wash on the outskirts of the city. And so she had her car, and on one wall beside her was graffiti that said "Death to Russians," and on the other wall on the other side said "Russians go home." And she was there with her car, which had Russian license plates on it. And so she described in that moment feeling very vulnerable and quite scared. And so ultimately, what I've determined about the graffiti in Tbilisi is that graffiti in Tbilisi reveals significantly less about Georgian public opinion on Russian migrants in Georgia, and more about how participants understood their overall sense of well-being in Tbilisi. So why do I say it's a poor barometer of Georgian public opinion? Firstly, interesting anti-Russian graffiti is shared widely. So for example, this one about Khachapuri appeared in multiple news articles about Russians that had moved to Georgia. And this one, No Russian is Welcome, Good or Bad, at a wonderful conference organized in part by Olga on tensions and cooperation in the South Caucasus. I believe that this photo of this exact graffiti from this street, like this exact graffiti, appeared in 3 different presentations, right? So graffiti can either be overlooked or magnified depending on the audience and the means of circulation. So the second reason why graffiti can't be trusted as a barometer of Georgian public opinion is because, as it turns out, a portion of the anti-Russian graffiti in Georgia may have actually been written by a Russian. So I'm going to spare you the Twitter drama, but essentially what happened was that a video circulated of a drunk Russian man spray painting this iconic "Russians go home" graffiti on a wall. To me, at least, the handwriting looked very familiar, and it was in the same blue color that this graffiti had been all over the city. So the man claimed in a Telegram post that he had just been drunk and only done it one time. I personally found the evidence to be quite damning. So why is this important to establish? The reason is because the ways that my participants reacted to the graffiti told me more about their perceptions of their own safety than it did necessarily about the material conditions around them. And that's not to dismiss those perceptions. I don't want to come across as dismissive, because how somebody perceives their environment is very, very important to their well-being. If somebody perceives an incredibly safe environment as overwhelmingly dangerous, they're going to have the same sorts of reactions that they would have if they were actually in a dangerous environment. It is important to take these perceptions very seriously. However, understanding this as a perception gave me some insights into their wider beliefs about their environments and how they perceive their own identity. So for example, when I told Alyona, the one who was at the, sorry, yeah, okay. So for example, when I told Alyona, the person who was at the car wash, who felt threatened with this "Death to Russians" and "Russians go home" graffiti on the walls, when I told her, hey, good news, the graffiti, the "Russians go home," turns out it may have been painted by a Russian, she didn't believe me. She said, oh, he just did it one time. That wasn't him. So for her, the graffiti had a really big, she told me separately, the graffiti had a really big impact on her identity as a Russian. So while she was living in Russia, this identity had not factored in that prominently into how she viewed herself. And so for her, ironically, this graffiti really solidified her identity. And she told me that it made her feel defiant about it, that she felt more Russian than ever before. So the idea that this impact on her, this graffiti had been painted by a Russian, challenged the way that she felt about her position as an outsider in Georgia. So it was interesting because Alyona wasn't alone in being very aware, as I mentioned, of Russianness, the Russianness on the street. But the question then becomes, what about queerness? So I want to talk a little bit about how participants felt at queer events. So overall, my participants viewed Georgia as a deeply religious country, and they weren't wrong. According to a 2018 Pew Research Center poll, Georgians are overwhelmingly religious, and according to the same poll, unfortunately, overwhelmingly oppose same-sex marriage. And so as a result, it was interesting. Participants viewed Georgian homophobia as almost a sort of different flavor than Russian homophobia. So Georgian homophobia was religiously motivated rather than politically motivated, which some participants viewed to be more dangerous than the politically motivated homophobia. So this, while they may have viewed Georgian homophobia as maybe more inherently dangerous, this didn't necessarily mean that participants, Russian LGBTQ people, thought that this homophobia applied to them. So this prompted one participant to describe Georgia as a homophobic paradise, somehow both homophobic but also offering safety for Russian LGBTQ people. So an example of this and how it played out. So about the first week or so into my time in Tbilisi, I was invited to this party, and it was at a rented home in the suburbs of the city. And the majority of the guests at this party were Russian, but they had a Georgian drag queen who was performing later in the evening. And Georgia has a fantastic drag scene, by the way. And so before the drag queen's performance, I noticed that there had been these big gates at the property that had been open at the entire evening. And now people were going over before the drag show and closing the gates and locking them. And so when I asked my friend why the gates were now being closed, she responded that it was because of safety concerns. So she said, quote, "Foreigners can do whatever they want. You can be gay and Georgians will be all right with it because you're foreign. A Georgian drag queen, though, they will kill you for that." So this theory that Russian LGBTQ people were somehow freer to express themselves in Georgia than Georgian queers was one that came up multiple times with my participants. So full disclosure, due to the siloed nature of Russian and Georgian queer communities, I had shockingly little interaction with the Georgian LGBTQ community during the course of my fieldwork. So this means that I have no way to corroborate this theory, and I have no frame of reference for whether my Russian participants were experiencing homophobia in Georgia any differently than their Georgian counterparts. Instead, much like the case of the graffiti, I'm interested in how Russian LGBTQ people perceived their safety and security at queer events and the tensions that appear within these narratives. So on the one hand, many of my participants were able to partake in LGBTQ events that would have been completely impossible for them at home. So Tbilisi has a thriving LGBTQ scene, and with things like organized pride events, drag balls, and even queer walking tours of the city. There were also Russian organized LGBTQ events in Tbilisi, such as queer support groups, queer parties, things that would no longer be possible to do in Russia, or certainly not possible to do and promote publicly. So participation in these events supported what my participants had told me in interviews, that they had a greater freedom of expression as queer people in Georgia than they would have had if they remained in Russia. However, the theory that they were somehow immune or protected from Georgian homophobia as foreigners was not always supported by the experiences that participants told me about. So coming back to that story about AJ, the non-binary person who was chased down the street. So I wrote in my field notes about the incident. "The other day, a group of Georgian men at the grocery store mistook AJ for a gay man. AJ's voice has been changing due to the testosterone. On some days, it is deep enough that they are mistaken for male. However, they still paint their nails and their appearance is overall very queer." Quote, "The guys were trying to say things to me in English. I just wanted to buy bread. The men chased AJ down, but thankfully they escaped. Quote, I've never run faster in my life." So the fact that AJ's attackers understood that they were a foreigner, but pursued them anyway, challenges this perception that my participants' Russianness was a shield against Georgian homophobia. So to quickly bring things to a conclusion, summing up some of the points that I have made here, safety for Russian LGBTQ people does not begin and end with migration. Georgia has allowed participants more freedom for queer expression than they would have felt or they would have had if they had remained in Russia, but that was within limits. And sometimes perceptions of this freedom outstripped reality and vice versa. And as I mentioned, feelings of safety were subjective and varied widely depending on participants' general sort of feelings and overall feelings about their place in Georgia. So I will end there. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm including a picture of as I always do, of my favorite graffiti from Tbilisi, and it says, "Future is gay." So there we go. Let me.
Thank you very much, Talia, for this Amazing presentation. It was really interesting. Thank you very much. Maybe we can start with your questions. With questions by audience. I don't know if we already have questions. I have questions, but I can wait.
Please, by all means.
Si vous voulez, vous pouvez écrire vos questions en français, en anglais, comme vous voulez, dans le chat. Donc, n'hésitez pas à prendre la parole, à allumer votre micro ou à écrire vos questions dans le chat. I just don't like that they can write questions in the chat. So if we don't have questions right now, maybe I will start with my few questions. I was thinking, thank you very much again for this presentation. It was really interesting to hear you the second time, because the first time was in Georgia, in Tbilisi a few months ago, and it was also amazing. But this time it's different. Thank you very much for for presenting your different angle of research. So it's thank you. And my question is, what about a kind of social professional profiles of these LGBTQ people that you mentioned? You said that they're rather comfortable from the financial point of view, but yeah, it depends how we define what is comfortable, but they are okay, if I understood well. And do they continue to work remotely? And if yes, for Russian companies or for foreign companies situated, I don't know, for example, in some European countries or in Georgia, let's say, what is this job, what this work, what they are doing? Or maybe they can they had the possibility to have a job in Georgia. I've met some people like that in Georgia who found something in Georgia. And the second question, or the third question, what about their integration in other Russian-speaking communities in Tbilisi or in Georgia? In volunteering milieu, because I studied, as you know, as I said, I'm doing research on volunteering milieu of Russian speaking, of Russians, exiled person, but also some Ukrainians who are integrated in this milieu. And so I've met a lot of LGBTQ people from Russia in these volunteering structures. And also in some political organization and initiative in Georgia. So what is your opinion about that, the integration in other Russian-speaking communities in Georgia? First question.
Fantastic. Yeah, so I'll start with the first one about social and sort of professional profiles. Yeah, so financially, definitely an overrepresentation of IT. So people who are doing computer programming, which makes sense both from the ability to have the financial ability to move, but also in terms of online work. So most people who moved tended to be, again, with the exception of people who it really wasn't a choice, tended to be people who were able to do online work. The thing was that just because somebody had a job when they moved, and the moving process itself was hugely expensive. Tickets went up like 10 times in price to get to Georgia, for example. Rent skyrocketed. Moving just in general is expensive. People had to give away all of their possessions and buy new ones, right? So overnight, people who maybe in Russia would be considered to be quite financially stable were in a completely precarious position. But the other thing that happened while I was in Georgia was this tech, I don't know if it's a bubble burst or slowdown or something, started to take place. And the other thing, so all of a sudden people who had these really well-paying jobs that were considered to be sort of luxury jobs and all of this, suddenly there weren't any enough to go around. The other thing that happened was that for people who did work at Russian companies, companies folded. sanctions, companies that had been sort of international companies now no longer were operating. So people did lose their jobs. And yeah, in terms of so that basically there was this sort of phenomenon now where all of a sudden people were in another country. What they considered to be dependable financial work before was no longer available. The other thing, and I have to look into whether or not participants were talking to me about this. I have to look into whether or not this was the case before the full-scale invasion or whether this was enacted afterwards. But from what I understand, there was a massive tax that kicked in for Russian workers working for Russian companies abroad. And so if you lived abroad for more than a few months, all of a sudden you had to pay sort of 30% more on your tax or something like that. And so the result of that was also that people who had maybe had this sort of seraya zarplata, or this like in between legal and illegal sort of some under the table and some over the table, or a completely over the table employment, if they were lucky enough to keep their employment, were now completely under the table employment, right? So there was some benefits and things that were lost there, some security that was lost there. So yes, long story short, people came that tended to be have the financial means to do so, but that changed really quickly for a lot of people. In terms of were they working for Russian or foreign companies? It was a split. Some of the luckiest people I talked to were people whose foreign companies moved them to Georgia after the full-scale invasion. That was sort of the best situation. Some people had hybrid situations, so would work one job for a Russian company and one job for a Georgian company. I will say the number of people who worked for Georgian companies or had employment in Georgia for Georgians was like minuscule. For the people who I knew who had work in Georgia, they were mostly working for Russian businesses in Georgia. And this was, I mean, partially because very, very few people spoke the language or were able to get to the point. I don't know if I maybe had one person I knew who got their Georgian to the point where it was like maybe able to be used professionally, maybe. So that's obviously a barrier. So for example, I had participants who worked in like queer services, queer counseling, queer help for HIV, for example, this sort of thing. And that was their profession in Russia. That's not a profession that they can do in Georgia, right? There's healthcare for HIV, for example, in Georgia, but they require someone who speaks Georgian. So some people arrived without work, and that was definitely the hardest situation for people who arrived with meager savings, maybe some help. And so for the case, I think what distinguished LGBTQ people from sort of the wider, I think lots of what I was saying is applicable to the sort of wider population of Russians in Georgia, at least part of it. But what distinguished LGBTQ people was also people who previously worked for NGOs, who worked with organizations that were increasingly demonized and increasingly had funding cut off in Russia until sanctions, and then that money completely was gone. So organizations like the sort of LGBT network and this sort of thing, that now that stream of revenue was completely gone. And so people would try and sort of pick up piecemeal, so grants here, maybe writing for a publication somewhere else, some sort of queer something or other. There was an aspect of it of searching for additional queer work, the type of thing that they'd done in Russia. About integration into other communities. Yes, it's interesting because the community of Russians more broadly in Georgia was significantly more self-selecting. So it tended to be people who were significantly further left. And so what I saw interesting, and queer people, I found, at least through my experience, were overrepresented. So there was a significantly larger proportion of queer people in queer Russians in Georgia than there were percentage-wise in Russia. And so what I found was that because the wider population tended to skew more sort of left and liberal, there was actually this really strange phenomenon of heterosexual parties or heterosexual groups or organizations describing themselves as LGBTQ friendly. And so you would go to a party, for example, there was a really fun, amazing party in Tbilisi called Show Me Love. And this was a queer art initiative. And I went with a friend of mine, and we're at this party, and we look around, and my friend looks at me and goes, "Where are all the gays?" Because this party was a queer party. It was organized. It was supposed to be a sort of queer friendly. And all of the straight people showed up, in part because, we throw a good party, but also because, there was this sense of like, I am queer friendly. It's being sort of inclusive of LGBTQ issues was a way of showing that you were really separate. from the Kremlin, separate from the Russian regime, right? So it was interesting. You asked about LGBT integration into straight communities. I would almost flip that, sort of straight integration into queer communities. At the same time, there was definitely a push among queer people to find queer communities specifically. So I had a friend who refused to get his hair cut by anything other than a queer barber. He was not going to go to a straight hairdresser to save his life. And that was very important to him. So there was still, despite there being integration into heterosexual communities, there was still this push to bring together and collect in that way. Yeah. Hopefully that wasn't too long an answer. We have time, right? We're okay?
Yeah, we will have
great.
We're having a lot of time.
Okay, good.
So we have, thank you very much for your answer. It was great. We have two questions. Alexander, if I have a question. And then another question. Yeah, but I will read it later. Alexander, if you want to ask your question, please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah.
Talia, thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. Actually, I myself do the same with similar research. I'm interested in LGBT people, but in Russophone LGBT people, so not only in Russian. So I'm interested in how Russophone LGBT are trying to adapt in different countries after the February 2022. So my question is actually whether you find something interesting in terms of communication of Russian LGBT in Georgia with Ukrainian LGBT, because I suppose that there is some Ukrainian LGBT community, and my impression is that actually they prefer do not hang out together. And so what's about Georgia?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. And I'm so glad you brought up this like Russophone as opposed to Russian, because one of the things that did surprise me was that the times when I did see Russian and Ukrainian LGBT communities or groups overlap was almost the exception that proved the rule. So there was almost no overlap, essentially. So I remember, for example, I can remember that the few times that I did see this type of overlap. So, for example, at a restaurant, and I was sitting around a table with a group of people, and people invited friends, so it was people I didn't know. And it turns out that two of the people I was sitting next to, it was a Ukrainian and Russian pair, two gay people, boyfriends. And it goes to show that these relationships do exist, and they predated the full-scale invasion. But the fact that I can remember that one in particular goes to show how rare that I encountered that, at least. The other thing, I mean, again, yes, there was overlap at one point. One of my participants had helped a Ukrainian friend move to Georgia. And it was very interesting to see the ways in which she behaved herself in the sort of in comparison in an environment with that friend in comparison to when it was a Russian-only group, right? Definitely more cautious about what she might have been saying, not because she necessarily felt she'd done anything wrong, but it was a sort of treading on eggshells situation. What I also found very interesting was the Belarusian community in Georgia. There wasn't as much overlap between Russian and Belarusian LGBTQ communities than I would have expected, despite the fact that there's a decently large, well, I actually don't have statistics on that, but I noticed a lot of Belarusians in Tbilisi. For example, if you go to any protest that happens in Tbilisi against the full-scale invasion, there is a crowd of Belarusians that show up and they bring their Belarusian flags and they make their presence very well known. So they do exist, and I did, discuss and encounter a few Belarusians during my time, but I was genuinely surprised at the lack of overlap. So I would be very interested in hearing more about your research. Please feel free to send me an email, and I'd be interested to hear what you've encountered in other contexts about these overlap between Russophone communities. So
yeah, well, I'll do. Yeah, thank you very much.
Please, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have another question. So thank you, Archie. Oh yeah. A few questions. Are they planning to stay in Georgia? Are they thinking about possible future back in Russia, migration to another countries? And yeah, the question of Joa Carti.
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I had, of everyone I talked to, I only had one person say that she was planning to stay in Georgia, and guess what? She left. So I think most people, I think everyone sort of viewed Georgia as this sort of transit country. Because the reason for the choice of Georgia, and I should have gone into this a bit more, the reason for the choice of Georgia was because, for many people, was because Russians can enter Georgia for a year without needing to get a visa. So it's one of the few countries where Russians can do that. And so LGBT people are in a particularly sort of tight spot when they have to choose countries, LGBTQ Russians, because the list of places of countries where Russians can go that is even relatively favorable towards LGBTQ people without needing a visa first is Israel, pretty much. That's it. And that's not exactly an ideal choice. So Georgia was the sort of country of choice, but not necessarily the country that LGBTQ people wanted to stay in. And so, yeah, I mean, are people going to stay? No. In terms of going back, and I think even now I have people approach me about doing fieldwork now in Georgia, and a handful of the people who I spent time with when I was there have already left. The makeup of the city has already changed so much that I caution people not to get too excited about fieldwork there. It's going to be a very different realm now than it was before. In terms of going back to Russia, this is really interesting because one of the things I asked my participants when I did sort of formal structure, semi-structured interviews, and I did participant observation. And during the semi-structured interviews, one of the questions I would ask was, what do you think about the future for Russian LGBTQ? And I got a wide variety of responses. I am a decently pessimistic person, so I had expected decently pessimistic answers. But I was really surprised by a handful of people who were really, really felt very strongly about going back, really felt very strongly about it, and felt very strongly about hope for the future. So, for example, if you look at Levada polls on sort of public opinion on LGBTQ, they look very scary. If you look at the averages for the whole country of sort of the number of people who think queer people should be liquidated or whatever, I have issues with this type of polling in Russia in the first place, but that's another story. But if you look at younger generations specifically, they are significantly, well, within the comparatively, they are comparatively significantly more accepting of LGBTQ stuff. So I think many of those I talk to do want to go home. They do want to be a part of sort of building a space that is safer for LGBTQ people in Russia. When, how, what that looks like, that's a whole other story. But yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important question. So yeah, people are hoping to move elsewhere, essentially, is the answer, the short answer.
Thank you, Talia. We have also a question of Clara Weller, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Thank you so much for the great presentation. It was fascinating, and thank you for sharing all your insights and your anecdotes and everything that goes along. I'm also working about Georgia, but from the civil society perspective, and I'm interested in all the social and environmental activism there. So it also overlapped with people like claiming that left it there. So it was really interesting. And I have actually three questions, I guess. One that echoes a little bit what you said about integration already. I wonder to what extent does the queer identity, when you're a Russian individual going to Georgia, plays a role in the way that you try to be more integrated into Georgian society? Because for years now, I've been doing field work in Georgia, and I see since the invasion of Ukraine or this like Russian migration, how it makes a lot of Georgians, and they are tired of having all these Russians community coming over, not being integrating, not even sometimes speaking a single word of Georgian. And I wonder if this queer identity helps somehow people to link, or some Russian to also accept the fact that they are, I mean, it's of course, as you mentioned in the very beginning, not the country, we have to acknowledge, like as Russian individuals going there, that it's a country which is partly occupied by Russia and so on. So I wonder how much it plays a role, if it does play one. And also I wonder, when you shared the story of Daria in the beginning, and you said that she would have no problem about displaying a rainbow flag. And I wonder that if all this of this like Russian queer community going to Georgia, do they have in mind the events of the 5th of July that happened 2 years ago in the 2021? Because it was such a strong message that was sent also to the LGBT community, not only within Georgia, but also internationally. And so I wonder how much it plays, if it was something that was still discussed today. And and also I wanted you to maybe explain a little bit, or to develop a little bit further, if I caught you correctly, that you said that some of your participants would thought that their Russianness was a shield to homophobia. And I wanted you to develop a little bit about this.
Amazing questions. Yes. So I'm just very quickly writing down notes so I don't forget to okay. So yeah, the first question about queer identity as playing a role in integration. So I think the first answer is not as much as you think. So unfortunately, there is still all of these sort of issues between that prevent integration in general are reflected in the queer communities. However, there are some, and by the way, I don't know, David Reipel, who is at UCL, does absolutely fantastic work on this. He's currently doing his doctorate. I don't know if he's publishing anytime soon. But if you're interested in talking more about this, so he and I are hopefully going to work on something together in the future, because he looks at a lot of the same questions that I'm looking at, safety and security, but from the Georgian queer community perspective. Fantastic. So he's definitely somebody to get in touch with. So in terms of when does queer identity play a role in integration between Russian and Georgian LGBTQ communities, the short answer is sex, frankly. So the few people who I know who had overlap between Russian and Georgian LGBTQ sort of relationships met, for example, on Grindr, where, you know, language barrier matters a lot less. It wasn't only gay men as well. I had a friend of mine who, despite the fact that this woman didn't speak any Russian, and despite the fact that my friend didn't speak any Georgian, and neither of them spoke English, managed to sort of strike up a sort of start of a relationship. I don't know necessarily how far it got with those conditions, but managed to start up a sort of a relationship in that way. And that was purely based on the fact that they both found each other attractive, and they were both very clearly queer, right? So they managed to find each other. So queer identity does play a role, but I do want to be careful not to overstate what that role was. And so one of the questions I did ask my participants and my friends when I was there was, why not? You know, there's a sense of sort of queer international, you know, solidarity. Why not? And I think one of my friends really hit the nail on the head when he said, when you're not planning to stay, right? When you're there temporarily, you're burnt out, you're exhausted, you are terrified for the future. It is sort of, I don't want to say why get involved, but yeah, why get involved when you're planning to, you're hoping to leave, right? So why put down roots? So I think, to me, that was the most sort of straightforward answer as to why these communities didn't overlap. But again, there was, and so for big events like the drag balls and whatever, you would, you know, there was overlap. Oh gosh, there's so much I could talk about that as well. But yeah, sorry, I can come back to that if you want. So the rainbow flag, Daria, the rainbow flag, and yeah, thank you so much for bringing this up, because I was running out of time in the presentation, and I also wanted to be careful not to homophobia. And so for those who don't know, basically homophobic for this most recent year at Tbilisi Pride, it was canceled because essentially people came from across the country to protest the existence of these events happening. And it's not the first time that there's been violence or there's been violent protests against LGBT stuff in Georgia. Yes, this was absolutely something that was on the minds of participants. It was, again, I touched a bit on this idea of Georgian homophobia as being a little bit sort of more dangerous because it was sort of ideologically or religiously motivated as opposed to politically. But it was not necessarily something that I think was, I hesitate to say this, I don't know if it was that as shocking to Russian LGBTQ people who had been dealing with homophobic violence and attitudes for a very long time. I don't, this is a bit of me sort of projecting here a question. I don't have data to back that up. But that would maybe be my guess. But yes, I mean, people did discuss it, you did hear about it. But for example, when there were protests for the introduction of a potential sort of foreign agents law in Georgia, people were significantly more nervous about that, more interested in talking about that than they were about Pride, for example. Yes, to talk a little bit about Russianness as a shield. There was a fair bit of controversy with Russian LGBTQ organizers who came to Georgia, set up parties, and described themselves as the first or the only, right? They came to Georgia, set up a sort of queer party and said, the first queer party in Georgia. And Georgians who had been organizing parties now for a very long time looked at this and went, what the heck are you talking about? And so there was a sort of sense of, we've come here to do what the Georgians can't. We're bringing our enlightened. I don't want to be uncharitable. This is by no means not everyone. But this was the impression that was given off by saying we're here to organize the first sort of queer parties. In terms of whether or not, so yeah, people did sort of view the fact that they were foreigners, as I mentioned in that quote of sort of a foreign person being queer is fine, a Georgian drag queen, they'll kill you for that, right? This was a sentiment that was brought up repeatedly of sort of like, homophobia is a big problem here, but we can sort of do our own thing. And people are not going to bother us. And I mean, for the most part, the sort of parties and things that I attended, the things that I did with people was kind of true. You know, you could do tons of stuff that would be completely not possible in Russia. You would attract way too much attention. Venues wouldn't let you hire, for example, this sort of thing. But you were able to do that in Georgia. There was an example of this happening, not necessarily to do with LGBT stuff, but to do with sort of sex in general, in that Russians came to Georgia and found, Russians came to Georgia and opened sex toy stores. And those had not existed in Georgia, or they had existed, but they had been shut down sometimes by mobs, right? And if I remember correctly, Russians in Georgia set up 2 sex shops. And so this was an example of Russians sort of looking at this situation and saying, okay, we can maybe do this in, in a place where Georgians can't. When I asked one participant about why she thought this was possible for the sex shops in particular, she said it was because, I'm trying to remember, there were a few really interesting responses. One of which was, she said that Georgians were hesitant to confront Russians about this, that maybe they felt that it was, Russians may have some sort of connections. You don't know who Russians are connected to, whether she, sort of maybe implying mob, right? Or, you don't know whether they have money to sue you, whatever it is, right? So the concern of Russian retaliation would allow for a little bit more space is there as well. I forget what some of the other things were. A sort of sense of, because, of the religiosity of Georgians being a sort of Georgian Orthodox church, that people who acted outside of that church, it's sort of none of our business. Sort of they can do what they want elsewhere. But if it's a Georgian doing it, then this is the fear. So again, I want to be very clear that what I'm saying is not necessarily reflective of the actual conditions. This is reflective of like how people perceive them. So I want to be very clear about that. But I hope that answers your question. Okay, good. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Talia. Do we have other questions? Yes, Kirill, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Very interesting and very sort of, I think that this sort of research question has been circling around and finally somebody's doing it. So
thank you. Yeah.
That's great. I am a PhD student and my project has been a little bit about not the immigration, not the immigrants, but just sort of the image of Russia, that what kind of image Russia has in Sweden. And I also have coming up a project that is going to be precisely about LGBT migration of Russians to Sweden. So great to know that people are doing this type of research. I was wondering about the queer parties that you mentioned. I know this wasn't like a big thing in your presentation, but for some reason this came up in my research that I just did. There were these Russians who came to Sweden some time ago, and they organized these parties. And what I found was that they really sort of made interesting things in combining Russianness and sort of having this broad idea of Russia that wasn't really a Russia, but that they had this name of the party that didn't have anything to do with Russia. And then they really tried to incorporate all these sort of Russian regional identities and so on. But it wasn't really sexual. So these things were balanced. And sort of the music was the sort of popular Russian pop from the early 2000s, but then also a lot of hard bass. So with this specific kind of masculinity and stuff. I was wondering about these parties that you went to. What kind of music were they playing? And did you notice anything interesting that they were doing with Russianness or with Georgianness? Maybe something along the lines of the sort of post-colonial hybridity or anything like that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. The parties were fantastic. Those parties, especially the first one I went to, was one of those things where, like, as an anthropologist, I filled up a whole notebook. You know, it was great. So yeah, the parties. So it's interesting, this question about the combination of Russianness and sort of maybe some of the more local elements into the parties. What I found was that most of the time, the parties I went to were some sort of attempt at recreating a party from home. So sometimes this was explicit. Some of the parties were named the same thing that they'd been named. So there was one that had the same name that it had had in Moscow. And that was a little bit unfortunate for that party because apparently it had been canceled for some sort of questionable behavior or whatever, but they still brought the name over and the brand. I went to something called Queerioke, which was queer karaoke. So there's your musical element. I'm happy to talk about that in a minute as well. And that was also a recreation of a similar event, I think in St. Petersburg. I forget if it was, yeah. And so, yeah, there was really a sense of recreating things from home. And so this included some activities. So for example, I went to one around the holidays, around New Year, and somebody was dressed as a sort of slutty Santa, and you would go and sit on Santa's knee, and we would all do that, you know, that Russian thing of like going around the yolka and all of this, right? It was really a recreation of these communities. And a lot of the time, the people who attended these parties were the same people who would have attended them previously. So you had people who you didn't even know this person was in Georgia, but you recognized them at the party. Oh my God, what are you doing here, right? So that was definitely a sort of reflection of home. The other thing that felt, at least to me, was really reminiscent of the time that I spent in St. Petersburg was at these parties was a real celebration of art. Like there was the type of thing that I just don't think you could sell in the UK as a party. So like, you know, half an hour of interpretive dance. You know what I mean? Incredible, amazing. I was there for it. I'm trying to think of how I would convince people here that this was something that was worth their time to do on a Saturday night, right? So that to me felt also very sort of like a sort of cultural transplant. There was also there was at least attempts, there was a recognition that where we were was Georgia, right? There was this recognition. So for example, some of these events had Georgian speakers. So they would have a panel and the speaker would be, you know, they would invite a local Georgian activist to come speak, sometimes alongside Russian activists. There would be conversations about, for example, sex education, the role of journalism, this sort of thing. And so these events it was sort of strange because you would go from some sort of music waiting for the event to start, music shuts out, we're now in a lecture, seats are out, we're all sitting facing forward, watching this lecture. Afterwards, seats get cleared away, music comes back on, right? But I think what was interesting in these events was the use of English. So the host, God bless her, English, not her absolute favorite thing in the world. I think that's safe to say. And she stubbornly and insistently, despite the fact that I think the vast majority of people at these parties would have completely understood her if she spoke Russian, stuck with English the whole time. And that was sometimes explicit. One person who gave a lecture who then I ended up befriending, during that lecture, he was clearly struggling with expressing himself. And they had a translator there on hand in case he needed help translating the Russian into English. And he said, no, we're in Georgia. Actually, he said Sakhat Vela. We're in the Georgian name for Georgia. This is where we are, and I'm going to speak English. As this sort of, again, recognizing that Georgian wasn't a language he was going to learn. English was the sort of compromise, right? So there was that sort of hybridity that came in there. And again, there was an attempt to bring in Georgian speakers, talk about Georgian queer events. I will say, in terms of music, I can remember at one of these parties, so techno is a really big thing in Georgia, and I don't know anything about techno. So if it's some sort of specific techno and I've forgotten, I don't know the term, I apologize. But techno is a really big thing. And at one of these parties, they did have a Georgian DJ DJing. And I will say it was not popular. I did have a few friends who left early because they were like, this is not the music we want to be listening to, and they left. So sometimes these attempts were a bit of a flop. In terms of music, again, at this karaoke that I went to, for example, I think what was so interesting was that it was so much nostalgic music, right? Russian karaoke songs that people, you could tell, were just dying to sing and dying to hear again. Nostalgia played a huge factor, an absolutely huge factor. And in general, music came up a lot. I don't think I hadn't heard during the time in St. Petersburg that I lived here, the Vysyo idет по плану, I hadn't really heard people reference that song that much. It was a song. It happened. In Georgia, people were sort of referencing this all the time, of this sort of everything's terrible, Vysyo idет по плану, everything's going according to plan, this sort of throwback to this sort of this chaotic time that this music reflected. So music definitely played a large role. How I'm going to fit that into my dissertation, I have no idea. But yeah, do shoot me an email if you want to discuss it further.
Yes, I would. Thank you so much for the answer. Yes, very exciting about the music.
Yeah.
I would really love to do something about it as well, because
Yeah.
it's sort of this thing that I don't really know what it's doing in my dissertation either. But
there you go. Yeah. Have you read what is it? Roll Over Tchaikovsky?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. That's the dream.
That's a classic
for music. Yeah, absolutely. That's anyway. Thank you for your question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your questions. Do we have other questions? So actually, I have one question.
Please.
To continue the discussion about the other communities, the integration within the Georgian communities, LGBT communities, I mean, I was wondering if there are some connections with other LGBT communities, not Georgian, and not Russian, and not Ukrainian, but others. I don't know, for example, Iranian, or I don't know, Turkish LGBT communities, or do these LGBT person are just integrated to the Georgian LGBT community, or how it works?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. And it is one that my supervisor also asked me when I was doing my field work. And the answer I have found is that it is on a very individual basis. So when this does happen, it is generally because of the efforts of an individual, or it's because, for example, Dasha moved to Spain, so now we have a connection in Spain, right? Like that's this sort of thing. It was a lot less than I might have expected. I think there was a sort of general sympathy, but whether or not sort of a sense of solidarity on some level. But yeah, whether or not that actually materialized in actual connections was really just based on an individual's initiative and circumstance. What I kind of found was that because this community in Georgia left Russia in a sort of group, that this drive for integration, and I don't know about whether or not this is the case. Anecdotally, I can say, for example, friends who have moved to countries in the EU where they're not moving with a ready-made Russian LGBT community, they're just lucky enough to be able to get that asylum visa, this sort of humanitarian visa, to be able to go. In situations where there's not a large group, for friends of mine who have been lucky enough to make that move, they do integrate into those local communities. Whether or not they bring those connections back is another story. Whether or not they sort of maintain those connections with Russian communities and local communities in order to make a sort of international group is another story. So yes, long and short of it is kind of no. No, with a bit of a twist. Yeah. I didn't see that much evidence. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. If we don't have other questions, we have just some reactions. I don't know if you saw that. Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Thank
Thank you very much for inviting me. This was a pleasure.
And just a few words about the second webinar in March. It will be this Lison and Karine. I don't know if you are here, and with Philippa also. They're here, but I was wondering if you want to present to say a few words about your session in March, le 22 mars, donc la prochaine session. Hi. So I don't know if you want to say a few words about your presentation, le 22 of March.
Yeah. Ciao. Congratulations for your presentation. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Yeah, no, for the presentation in March, just to say a quick word. The idea is to show how I tried with Karine and Lison. We tried to map the experience of movement and let's say reception in Grenoble, in the region of Grenoble, by a method who's the cartographie sensible, trying to follow more the feeling and the emotional information we can collect from the experience, and not only the, let's say, administrative trajectory and so on. So this is the idea to share with you. Yeah, and this is in the context that maybe you know about the project we are working on it with Olga and Karine and other friends, Elison and other friends on the reception system of Ukrainian people in the region of.
Yeah. So. Thank you very much. So, ça va être le 22 mars à 14h, donc 22 of March at 2 p.m. As today. Thank you very much once again for your presentation, brilliant presentation, Talia, and we are waiting for the next presentation by Filippo and maybe Karine Lison. I don't know. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Talia and Olga.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao,
thank you for having me. Thank you.
Ciao, take care.
Merci beaucoup à tout le monde.
Ciao.
Hop.